In late October 2010, a Firefox plugin called Firesheep was released. It had a very simple premise. You walk into a cafe, connect to the unsecured Wi-Fi network, start it up, and watch. And if anyone else connected to their Facebook, Google, or Twitter accounts or did anything over an unencrypted connection, Firesheep would sniff out the credentials sent over the air, and with a click of a button, you could sign into their Facebook account. But when was the last time that you worried about typing your login details on an unsecured Wi-Fi network? And should you be? The answer to those questions are not in the past few years probably, and not really. And that's because of HTTPS. Today, just over 10 years after Firesheep, Firefox's telemetry reports that over 80% of the connections it makes are encrypted, and most of the websites you use on a daily basis have completely switched off unencrypted connections. The question I want to answer in this talk is, how did we get here? And I think the best way of doing that is to start from the very beginning, back in the early 1990s when the protocol was being designed. The core principle of HTTP is simple. You open a connection to a website, send a request, it sends back the data for the page you requested, and closes the connection. When you go to another page, you repeat this dance. It's simple, but the problem is that your requests and the server's responses are just bytes routed across the network. Anyone else on that network can see those bytes, record them, and tamper with them, both the request you sent as well as the page that the server sent back, which is not a great state of affairs. So let's fix that. The solution is seemingly simple. Just wrap it all in an encrypted tunnel and only exchange data over this encrypted connection. But when you encrypt, you need a key. And how do the client and server know each other's keys? This simple solution would only work if the client and server knew each other's keys beforehand, which might work in a small university computer lab, but is not scalable to a global network. A possible solution here is to use asymmetric encryption. Essentially, you have two keys, a public key and a private key, and something encrypted with a public key can only be decrypted by the private key. So when you open a connection, the server sends the client its public key, and then the client encrypts all the messages to the server with that public key, and then only the server can decrypt them. Let's also have the client generate its own key pair and send its public key to the server to ensure that its requests can't be tampered with. Now, eagle-eyed viewers may have noticed that there's nothing here stopping an attacker on the network from tampering with these keys, but that wouldn't give them much because all they can do is shut down all connections, which would be a bit useless. But there's still a problem here, which is that if the attacker records all the traffic to the server and then later steals its private key, it can decrypt all the historical messages, which is quite bad. This is known as forward secrecy, or the lack thereof. What's mostly used nowadays is actually symmetric encryption, but with a key that's generated once for each connection and thrown away once that connection is done. That way, even if the server's private key is stolen, the hacker can't decrypt the prior connections because each connection had its own key. Quick erratum here. While the client's request for page data and the server's response are done using symmetric encryption, the actual key for that symmetrically encrypted connection is negotiated using asymmetric encryption. I'll explain it properly in a minute, just felt it was important to clarify at this point. Anyway, back to the talk. So that's how the keys are derived and how our connection is secured. There's a fatal flaw here, though. In fact, there's two. One I'll come on to in just a second, but the other, arguably bigger one, is that we forgot to define a threat model. A good security engineer always comes up with a threat model before designing a security system, because you need an understanding of what types of attacks your system has to defend against. And our threat model in this case is a very broad one. We're assuming an attacker with complete control of everything between us and the server. The specification itself says, the TLS protocol is designed to establish a secure connection between a client and the server communicating over an insecure channel. Attackers are assumed to have the ability to capture, modify, delete, replay, and otherwise tamper with messages sent across this channel. And while I'm here, just a quick note on terminology. SSL stands for Secure Sockets Layer, and TLS stands for Transport Layer Security. The protocol that HTTPS uses for encryption used to be called SSL, but then it got renamed to TLS for trademark reasons. HTTPS is just HTTP plus either SSL or TLS. If we look at that threat model, the flaw that pops out is authenticity, because While we've ensured that the connection between the client and the server can't be tampered with, there's nothing to stop an attacker with control of the network to redirect your request to a website pretending to be the one you want. To fix this, we essentially need someone to vouch for the identity of that website. So who could do that? The web browser's vendor? No. The point of the World Wide Web is decentralization, and putting the browser vendor at the center of deciding who's legit is not exactly the best of ideas. Instead, we'll introduce another player, the certificate authority. Instead of having the browser vendor decide who to trust, they'll delegate that to a number of companies who then issue certificates to trustworthy websites. Trustworthy has an asterisk, I'll get onto that. It works a little bit like this. The server's administrator generates a private key, which it keeps secret, and a public key. It sends that public key to the certificate authority, or CA. The CA verifies that the admin really runs the website that they say they run, and attaches that information to the private key, along with some things about the CA itself and an expiration date, and then assigns all of that with its private key. The signed bundle is called a certificate, and it gives the certificate to the server admin. By the way, the CA also has a certificate called a root certificate, which is tied to its private key. Then, when anyone connects to this website, the server sends the browser this certificate. The browser checks that the key that signed the certificate is from a root of a CA that it trusts, that the certificate is not expired, and that it's valid for the website that the browser thinks it's connecting to. If anything there seems amiss, it stops and throws up a big red error message. The server and browser then somehow agree on a key to encrypt this one connection, as I described earlier. There's a number of ways of doing this. The most common these days is what's known as ephemeral Diffie-Hellman. I don't have the time to explain it here, but I do encourage you to look it up. It's an astoundingly clever piece of maths. Finally, once the browser has authenticated the server, and both sides have negotiated a key to use, the connection becomes encrypted, and you get the green padlock in your browser. Well, at least you used to. More on that later. The key linchpin in this protocol here is the private key. It must be kept secret, or the jig is up. In case the private key is compromised, or the CA finds out that it for some reason made a mistake in issuing the certificate, it can revoke it, essentially telling the browsers that that certificate should not be trusted anymore. At least in theory. Again, more on that later. The CA's root key, that I mentioned just a bit ago, must be kept even more secret, because if an attacker controls it, they can issue any certificates for any website ever trusted by all the major browsers. And if that key has to be revoked, it could take the CA months or even years to become trusted again. To keep all this safe, these root keys are kept in hardware security modules, or HSMs, which are purpose-built devices that you sign things with a private key without actually being able to access that private key because it's kept inside the box. And the HSMs containing the root keys are kept in a safe, in a vault, with very tightly controlled audited access. Another quick erratum, sorry I'm editing this now and I keep spotting these. This whole HSM business only applies to the private keys of a CA's root. This does not apply to Joe Random Hacker's website's private key. He could put it in a HSM, but there's no good reason to. Anyway, back to past me. But we haven't quite solved the problem yet, because we've punted the trust problem over to the CAs, but how do you know which CAs to trust? At the time of writing, Firefox trusts over 148 certificates from 50 different CAs. So how do Mozilla know that they're all doing everything correctly, and how do new CAs get trusted? And this is where an organization known as the CA Browser Forum comes in. As the name suggests, the CAB Forum is a meeting of the main browser vendors and the CAs that they trust. Together, they produce a document known as the Baseline Requirements, which are the rules that all CAs have to follow if they want to be trusted by a browser. The BRs are, at the time of writing, 96 pages long and describe in precise language exactly how the certificate lifecycle works, how they're allowed to validate domain control, how key material must be stored, when certificates need to get revoked, etc. And to ensure that CAs are complying with these rules, they must undergo a yearly audit by a licensed auditor. If a CA is found to be misbehaving or misissuing its certificates, it can be distrusted, so all websites running their certificates will show a red warning message. Distrust isn't an option that's taken lightly, but it has happened in the past. the two most notable examples being WoSign and Symantec. I'm not going to go into the details of why they were distrusted, because you can find all of that on the Mozilla Wiki, but the long and short of it is that a great many issues, both technical as well as management, led to the Mozilla and Google CA policy leads to no longer be able to trust WoSign or Symantec and gradually remove their trust in the root certificates so that Chrome and Firefox would no longer accept them for connecting to websites. But there's still a flaw in this beautiful ecosystem that we just built up. To fully grasp it though, let's take a look at two case studies. I mentioned earlier that the CA's private key is stored in an HSM, which means that even if someone were to hack the CA, they couldn't get to the private key. But that's not going to stop them from issuing certificates. Enter Diginotar. Diginotar was a Dutch CA, note the tense. In July 2011, they noticed an intrusion, which resulted in the fraudulent issuance of a number of certificates, including ones for Google.com. Diginotar revoked all the fraudulent certificates, except one, which went unnoticed for over a month, until August 28, 2011, when a Chrome user in Iran noticed an alert for an insecure connection to Google.com. This was possible not because there was something wrong with the certificate per se. It was a perfectly valid certificate from a root trusted by the system, that being Diginotar's, but because Chrome implements a system called pinning, which is where it has a hard-coded list of certificates that it trusts for Google's domains, and it only allows those. Diginotar was very much not on that list, and so Chrome sent an alert to the Google security team. The certificate was revoked a day later, but the damage had already been done, and to make matters worse, Diginotar hadn't told anyone about the initial hack. And now that the cat was out of the bag, they revealed that anywhere between 247 and 531 certificates were issued by the attackers for domains like Yahoo, Mozilla, WordPress, and the Tor project. The browsers were now not sure that they could trust any Diginotar certificates because it may have been issued during the hack, so collectively they decided to remove trust from Diginotar's entire hierarchy. To make matters even worse, Diginotar was one of the 5 CAs trusted by the Dutch government to issue certificates in its public key infrastructure program, and revoking trust in Diginotar meant that quite a few Dutch government websites were inaccessible. As you might imagine, when you can no longer trust a company whose entire business model depends on trust, that company can't exist for much longer, and Diginotar went bankrupt in 2011. Let's now look at another case study, but before that I need to do just a little bit more explanation. As I mentioned, for a CA, keeping the root key secure is extremely important because if it gets compromised, your entire hierarchy is gone. So issuing certificates directly off the root is far too risky. Instead, CAs create what are known as intermediate certificates, which also have the power to issue certificates, these known as end-entity certificates, which are the ones you find installed on websites and servers. These intermediates are also kept secure because an attacker with an intermediate has the power to issue whatever certificates they want, but they're slightly less secure than the root because loss of the root is an extinction level event for the CA, whereas if an intermediate is lost, they can revoke it and issue a new one. So the intermediates are still kept in HSMs, but not in physical safes inside bank vaults. So to the case study. On December 24th, 2012, Chrome detected, again through its pinning mechanism, an unauthorized certificate for Google.com and a lot of other Google domains. Chrome alerted Google's security team, who discovered that the certificate was issued by an intermediate linked to a Turkish CA called TurkTrust. Turns out that back in August 2011, TurkTrust mistakenly issued 2 intermediate certificates which should have been end entities. The owner of one of these certificates alerted TurkTrust, who revoked it. The other was issued to the municipal government of Ankara, where the system administrator installed it on a checkpoint firewall. Recall that part of the principle behind HTTPS is that nothing between you and the server you're connecting to can decrypt the connection, which includes corporate firewalls and proxies, which organizations like banks and governments may not like. Checkpoint firewalls allow you to get around this by giving them a certificate and private key, which they will then use to intercept all encrypted connections and re-encrypt them with that certificate, while still being able to analyze the traffic. This is normally meant to be done using a private route that's trusted only by the computers in the organization using the firewall, but it looks like the Ankara admin decided to use the mistakenly issued TurkTrust intermediate, which would have had the power to generate certificates that users' browsers would have trusted without needing to install anything. So this firewall generated a certificate for google.com, which Chrome's pinning picked up. And just another quick erratum, Checkpoint is a brand. Other brands of HTTPS intercepting firewalls are available. Both of these case studies highlight what is both a huge benefit and a fatal flaw with the CA ecosystem, which is that any CA can issue a certificate for any domain. This means that you aren't locked into a CA just because of your domain, but it also means that there's no way for you to control or even know which certificates are issued for your domain. These two cases were picked up by Chrome's pinning mechanism, so you might ask, why doesn't everyone use pinning? And indeed, there is a standard for this called HTTP Public Key Pinning, or HPKP. The only issue is that HPKP is considered deprecated, and most CAs explicitly warn against using pinning. And the reason for this is that it makes replacing a certificate difficult, if not impossible, because suppose that your CA detects that it made a mistake in its processes and needs to revoke your certificate, which is rare, but not unheard of. The trouble is that to the browser, there's no way to tell the difference between you, the server owner, legitimately replacing a certificate, and someone having compromised your site, redirected requests, and installed their own purloined certificate on it. And since these pins are valid for up to a year, some of your users may not be able to access your website unless they manually reset the pin. Chrome doesn't have this problem because its pins are distributed through software updates, which it can do at any time, but this doesn't scale to the web. But let's take a step back. Do we really need this level of control about which certificates can be issued to our site? Maybe just knowing about misissued certificates is enough so that we can take action. And this is where certificate transparency comes in. Certificate transparency, or CT, is a system originally designed by 3 Google security engineers with the goal of making it near impossible to issue a certificate for a website without at least someone knowing about it. It works like this. A number of key players in the web security ecosystem run CT logs. Google runs several, Cloudflare runs a few, DigiCert and Sectago, 2 major CAs, run their own, and so on. Then, when a CA issues a certificate, it adds it to one of these logs, essentially telling the world that the certificate exists. Any certificate trusted by the major browsers needs to be in these logs. For example, Google's policy is that it'll only accept a certificate if it's trusted by one Google and one non-Google log. These logs use a data structure known as a Merkle tree. No, not that type of Merkle tree, which, without getting into too much detail on the cryptography, which you can read about if you're interested, prevents modifying it or removing entry in the tree once it's been added without invalidating the rest of the tree. A bit like a blockchain, just without all the scams. To avoid having to go through the entire log to check that a certificate is valid every time, when the log adds a certificate, it returns what's known as a signed certificate timestamp, essentially a signed promise to include the certificate in the log at some point in the future. These SCTs are then attached to the certificate itself and used by browsers to validate the certificate. Now you might spot a problem here, which is that a log can issue an SCT and then not add the certificates to the log, but in practice this gets spotted quickly enough, and the standards for getting a log trusted in the browsers are very high, almost as high as getting a root certificate in. The final players in the ecosystem are auditors, which are servers or people who verify that the logs are behaving properly the whole time. The upshot of all this is that once a certificate is in a CT log, there's no way to not know about it, and since about 2018, inclusion in the logs has been a prerequisite for trust by all the major browsers. There's still 2 more problems in the ecosystem that I want to go through. First, let's go back to revocation. When a CA revokes a certificate, it's telling the world that that certificate should no longer be trusted for one reason or another, and the browser should refuse to accept it. The only problem is that revocation checking as a concept, the way it works now, is fundamentally broken. That's a strong statement, so let me explain. There are 2 ways for a CA to tell a browser that a certificate is revoked. The first is certificate revocation lists, or CRLs. They're exactly what it sounds like. A list of every certificate ever issued by a given intermediate that's since been revoked. Almost all certificates have a URL to one of these CRLs embedded in it, and periodically the browser downloads the CRLs and checks whether the websites it's connecting to are on them. The problem with CRLs is that as the number of certificates in existence grows, so will the size of the CRL. After a particularly damaging vulnerability called Heartbleed was disclosed, the details are outside the scope of this talk but well worth reading about, tens of thousands of certificates needed to be revoked, and once they were all added to the CRLs, one CA in particular, GlobalSign, saw its CRLs increase in size by about 4.5 megabytes. Which doesn't sound like much, but 1. Consider networks in developing countries where 4.5 megabytes may take quite a while to download, and 2. The revocation generated 40 gigabits per second of traffic to GlobalSign servers, which, as a benchmark, if the CRL were hosted on something like Amazon S3, would cost $900,000 a month. The other way is OCSP, the Online Certificate Status Protocol. OCSP works the other way around. Instead of the CA giving a browser a list of revoked certificates, the browser asks the CA each time it connects whether a given certificate is revoked. This solves the size problem. However, both CRLs and OCSP have a fatal flaw. We need to go back to our threat model to see it. Recall that I said that HTTPS is meant to work on an untrusted network where an attacker could tamper with anything between you and the server you're connecting to. Now, suppose they tamper with the root to the CRL or OCSP server and kill all connections to it so that the browser can't check if a certificate is revoked. At this point, it has two options. 1, it can assume that the certificate is invalid and refuse to connect to that website because it's not sure. But that means that the attacker can kill your entire internet connection, which is bad. Or it can assume that the certificate is valid until proven otherwise. But that means that the attacker can use revoked certificates and your browser can't check, which is also bad. And this isn't a theoretical problem. I bet that you've been on a network that does exactly this sort of tampering hundreds of times. You remember these? Think back to every time you connect to a public Wi-Fi hotspot and need to sign in before you can surf the web. That's an example of a network that does exactly what I've just described. Revocation checking is so broken that since about 2012, Chrome just hasn't bothered. So what's the alternative? Well, for high-value certificates, both Google and Mozilla have a way to deploy a block list via software updates. Google calls it CRL sets, while Mozilla calls theirs one CRL. But this isn't remotely scalable to the size of the web. There's another way, known as OCSP stapling, where the web server returns an OCSP response along with the certificate when you open a connection. But due to the need for backwards compatibility, it'll never reach the levels of adoption that it needs to be effective. It turns out that revocation checking is one of the big unsolved problems of this whole ecosystem, but there's a way around it, which I'll get to in a minute. But we still have one major problem to discuss, though. Historically, certificates have cost an amount of money, which has been a major blocker to adoption, so much so that until around 2008, only banking, government, and e-commerce sites had encryption, because it wasn't seen as necessary for everyone else. And it was only in 2010 that Gmail switched to HTTPS by default. Firesheep, the extension that I mentioned way back at the beginning, was a major wake-up call to the need for this, but Twitter only went HTTPS by default in 2012, and these certificates were still out of reach for many smaller businesses, and the ones that could afford them didn't see the point. There was a company called Startcom that offered free SSL certificates, but their website was a pain in the neck to use. I still remember using it to secure my first personal website. And they used to charge $25 to revoke a certificate, which is a major security yikes. Furthermore, Startcom was acquired by another CA called WoSign, which I mentioned earlier was distrusted due to a spate of management issues. So for the longest time, SSL was out of reach of smaller websites. And then came Let's Encrypt. Let's Encrypt is a CA launched in April 2016 that had a completely different business model to all the other CAs. It's a non-profit supported by Mozilla and the Linux Foundation that issues certificates valid for 90 days automatically for free. To say that this is a seismic shift is an understatement. Suddenly, any administrator anywhere can get a certificate for free by just running a Python script on their server. Let's Encrypt issued its first 10 million certificates in September 2016, and in February this year that number hit 1 billion. Meanwhile, the percentage of page loads using encryption in 2014, according to Mozilla telemetry, was just around 25%, while in October 2020 that number was closer to 80%. And since replacing certificates is completely automated, Let's Encrypt can get away with reducing the lifetime of these certificates to just 3 months, which is actually, when you think about it, a way around the revocation checking problem, because if a certificate is only valid for 3 months, then even if an attacker compromises it, they have to use it quickly or it will expire soon. It doesn't solve the problem, but it does mitigate it. As you can imagine, Let's Encrypt faced quite a bit of opposition, the majority of it from CAs whose business model is very much under threat here. Komodo, one of the bigger CAs out there, tried some rather shady tactics against Let's Encrypt back in 2016, filing a trademark for Let's Encrypt with Komodo, and Komodo Let's Encrypt, which didn't go too well for them. Quite a number of other CAs have been accused of sowing fear, uncertainty, and doubt about Let's Encrypt's practices. They do raise one criticism worthy of discussion, though, which is, surely all these green padlocks for any website in the world are going to be abused by phishers and scammers. I think that's a false premise. The green padlock has never actually meant that the website you're accessing isn't scamming you, only that the site's operator really does control the domain that they say they do. So I couldn't get a certificate for PayPal.com, but there's nothing to stop me from getting a certificate for PayPal totally not a scam site, please give me money.com. And that, I think, is how it should be. It should be up to the browser and the user to decide whether a website is safe, and not the CA. Trying to set a scam site, not scam site threshold is a losing battle, and quite rightly, Let's Encrypt haven't bothered. They do have a block list of high-value targets for which they won't issue certificates, but that list is relatively small. What does need fighting is the perception that padlock equals legit, and Google is taking a somewhat unconventional approach to this by getting rid of the padlock altogether. It's been doing this slowly, first by removing the explicit green secure text, then marking unencrypted sites red, then making the green padlock gray, and eventually removing it altogether, finally marking the era of HTTPS by default. But let's be honest, how many of us check that padlock before typing in our passwords? Not that many. There are so many things that I've simplified and glossed over in this talk. I haven't even mentioned why extended validation isn't as useful as it sounds, the work being done to prevent snoopers from learning which websites you visit, and how Apple has strong-armed the industry into reducing certificate lifetimes from 10 years down to just 1. And I really do encourage you to read up on all of those topics, because there's so much to learn about this ecosystem that we all use on a daily basis and never stop to think about. Also, if you want to see some of the behind-the-scenes discussions that go into making policy, look at the Mozilla Dev Security Policy Newsgroup, yes, Newsgroup, which is where all of Mozilla's PKI discussion happens. If you're watching this talk live, we'll have time at the end for questions on Discord. If you're watching the recording, feel free to chuck questions, comments, or hate mail to marks@markspolakovs.me or Twitter @markspolakovs. This has been the life and times of HTTPS. I've been Marks Polakovs. Thank you very much.